Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. In the month of December, I'm re-releasing 5 of your most favorite episodes, and today's episode is one of Faith and Feelings' most downloaded yet. This conversation was originally released as part of a series on emotional dysregulation. Another way to describe this term is the inability to control your insides. It's those moments when everything seems out of sorts. All of us experience emotional dysregulation, but so often we can get dysregulated without even realizing it. So how do we begin to notice and listen to what our bodies are trying to tell us? In this episode with licensed therapist David Floge, we talk about what emotional dysregulation is, what it can feel like in our bodies, and practical ways to self-regulate. This conversation is such a fun combination of clinical insight and personal experience. My hope is that you'll find it practical and you'll also laugh because some of the stories that David and I share are really funny. So let's go now to my conversation with David. Well, welcome to Faith and Feelings, David. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So I told you a little bit about this before I started recording, but earlier this morning, I was talking to my mom on the phone and I was telling her that I was doing a podcast recording with you today. And she was like, "Oh, that's so great." And then she told me, she was like, "Do you know that you met David and his family at Pre-Field?" And I had no idea that happened. I thought that was so cool.
Yes, it's a memory I have also. So it did occur.
Yeah. So that was in 2007. And as a therapist, you now work specifically with global workers and their families through the organization Vallejo. And when I was thinking about who I'd love to have on the podcast for this new series called Why on Earth Did I Say or Do That?, you came to mind. This series is all about dysregulation, and today I'm so thankful that you've agreed to help me unpack what this concept is. So to get started, I'm curious to hear about the first time you learned about the concept of dysregulation. When did you first begin noticing and being able to see it in your own life?
In my own life, I actually remember really early on in my life. I don't know if technically it was dysregulation, but I remember when my younger brother was born, and he had a very traumatic birth, and my mom was hospitalized, my younger brother was hospitalized. And I remember like the feeling as a 4-ish, 5-year-old of like, where is my mom? And then I remember going to visit my brother in the hospital. He was in the hospital for over a month, and it felt I felt really kind of, I guess the word would be dysregulated, right? My emotions felt kind of out of control. My behavior was different. I would have never put that together as a 4 and 5-year-old, but when I reflect back, I think that was happening. I didn't know what was happening.
Wow. Yeah. When did you first begin to be able to notice what was happening and name it as dysregulation?
Oh, for myself personally, that's really trying to think. I don't know if I would have really thought of it. Again, the thing that comes to my mind, which is interesting with that question, is that when my family, so my wife and our 3 kids, when we moved to Bangkok, Thailand. Of course, I had already finished my graduate degree. I was already a therapist. I had been working with people for a number of years. But personally, I remember when we moved to Bangkok and 3 little kids, we lived in this little tiny apartment in the street with people who were talking to us. We didn't know what was going on. And I started these body sensations like I'd never had before. I wasn't sleeping well. Everything seemed out of sorts. And so I remember actually yeah, like I couldn't regulate. I felt like I could not regulate myself. Right.
Yeah.
And and what awoke me to this really was one time I came home. I was working uh, at a school teaching English, which I was not trained in to do. And I came home and I was really upset, right? And I was angry about something. And I'm generally not an angry person. And my wife said to me, "When did you become angry?"
Wow.
And I was like, "Oh, crap. Like, wait, like, what do you mean?" Right. Um, and I remember her saying, "You're not the person who you were a few months ago or 6 months ago." And I started realizing I am dysregulated. Like, I can't control my emotions. I'm having difficulty with rational thought. um, I'm kind of doing impulsive things in my frustration. Um, so I might have recognized it, Taylor, before then, but I really remember it clearly then. That was 2004.
Yeah. I just keep going back to what you said a couple minutes ago. Everything seems out of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a good way to describe dysregulation.
Yeah.
How would you define this concept? I know it was a new term to me when I first started grad school, is when I heard it for the first time. But how would you define dysregulation, and why do we get
Yeah.
dysregulated?
Well, I think dysregulation is a really cool word. I think it gets a little bit overused these days. It's kind of like the word trauma. You know, a lot of people say like, "Oh, that was a traumatic event."
Mm-hmm.
It may or may not have been, but so dysregulation can kind of be the same thing. But for me, defining dysregulation, right? Like we have an individual, and a lot. I work with a lot of kids. It's one of the things I do a lot of work with. So sometimes we can even see this more. It can be more evident in children, right? They have difficulty regulating emotions, feeling overwhelmed, uh, having difficulty controlling impulsive behaviors, right? And a lot of times, dysregulation involves anger, kind of like an angry outburst. It doesn't have to per se, but a lot of times it does. So, and then these responses usually lead to trouble with relationships, right? So that's kind of how I look at it and define it.
Yeah.
And then there was a follow-up question which you asked me, which I totally forgot at this point. So
Why do we get dysregulated?
yes, why do we get dysregulated, right? If you go back to my story of when I was 4 or 5, my mom, who was my regulator, like suddenly was gone, right?
Yeah.
I remember my dad saying, "Oh, mom's going to have the baby. She'll be home in like 2 or 3 days." She wasn't, right? It was me and my older brother. I was like, "What? Like, what is happening? Where's my mother? And I'm supposed to have a baby brother now." And then, right? So like things were out of control. They were difficult. So same, often a lot of dysregulation for children begins maybe with trauma or not having their regulator, mother, father around, or there's a lot of difficulty happening. So that can be a root of it. For me, getting dysregulated as an adult in 2004, you know, I felt out of control. Like everything I knew from like 3 months previously was gone, except my wife and 3 kids, right? So dysregulation, we get overwhelmed. Our brains get overwhelmed, right? So we can kind of go. I think we'll talk some about window of tolerance, maybe too. I hope so, because I love window of tolerance talk. But right, things are out of our control, and our bodies don't know what to do. Our brains don't know what to do. So that's the simplest way I would kind of look at it.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so window of tolerance.
Yeah.
It's something I'm so interested in. I remember the first time, I think I was either reading a textbook about it or I was listening to a podcast by a therapist who was talking about it. And the first time I heard the term and heard it described, I was like, this is making so much sense. I feel like this is describing and helping me understand what I feel and why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. So can you talk a little bit about what the window of tolerance is?
Yeah, I mean, window of tolerance, I think it was Daniel Siegel maybe who kind of initiated this idea, right? Like, right. And he said something like, it's the window of tolerance. We know we're in our window of tolerance, right? So I like to, especially as I'm working with kids, I may not say window of tolerance, but kind of talk about healthy range of functioning, right?
Yeah.
So we're in this window where, you know, we're coping well with the ups and downs. Our thoughts are rational and our emotions are calm, right? So that's kind of how Daniel Siegel said it, right? So I really like that. Like, and the window of tolerance. We may be near the top, we may be near the bottom of our personal window of tolerance, which is also important to remember. Everybody's is different, right? There's no kind of like, oh, it's fixed here. But the window of tolerance, and again, I just think of a lot of kids I've worked with over the years, right?
Yeah.
You know, there can be that idea of, right, the kind of the hyper arousal. So
Yeah.
going out the top of our window of tolerance, right? That fight, flight response, lots of energy. Or sometimes we dip below out of our window of tolerance. We kind of go into that hypoarousal, right? We kind of freeze. We're exhausted. We're depressed. We collapse. We shut down, right? So window of tolerance is just that idea. I mean, like, you know, it's just a healthy range of functioning, right? With our thoughts and with our thinking. I think that's the best way to think about it.
Yeah. So if you were to think of the window of tolerance on a scale of 1 to 10, so like 4 to 6 maybe-ish would be like you're in your window of tolerance. And then how would you put it on a scale like that?
Yeah, I'm an EMDR therapist also, which I really love doing EMDR. It's an amazing thing. And in EMDR, at least the training I've done, right? We kind of talk about this healthy range of functioning window of tolerance, kind of like, you know, 60-40, 70-30, right? So kind of like maybe 3 to 7, if we're talking 1 to 10, 3 to 7, where again, it's kind of different for everybody. And maybe my 3 is a little different than your 3 or whatever. But yeah, just thinking of kind of like, I mean, I know when I'm down.
Yeah.
Like, I know when I'm kind of in the 3 to 4 range. And I know when I'm like at the 6-7 range. Like the other day, I don't drink coffee. The other day I drank coffee because I was super tired. And my wife was like, I talked to my wife, she's like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I had some coffee, right? And I was like, I felt like I was getting ready to, you know, burst out of my window of tolerance. Like, woo. So anyway, that's probably more than you're asking, but I kind of think of it like 7 to 3, 4 to 6, right? And just trying to, even for myself personally, be aware of like when I'm getting up too high or when I'm getting down too low, and then what I need to do about that. But
yeah.
You know.
So what's happening inside of our bodies and brains when we move outside of our window of tolerance, either direction?
Yeah. So I'll speak for me personally, right? I start the first time that I ever had a really strong, I think, outside of my window of tolerance was actually when I moved from from Bangkok to Chiang Mai. I was very busy, was working as a therapist, little kids, and a lot of stress. I mean, I probably was like at the 7 for quite a while. Like I just knew. And one morning, woke up, I was getting ready for work, and all of a sudden, Taylor, it's one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. All of a sudden, like my face was numb.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, oh, that doesn't feel very good. Like, because I can't feel my face. And pretty quickly, my fingers were going numb. And being a dedicated worker that I was, having appointments that day, I was like, oh, well, like, I guess this is what's happening today. So I was trying to get ready. And actually, my wife came in and I was like, I can't feel my face. And she was like, like that's not good, right? So our bodies, when we're moving out of our window of tolerance, whether it's up or down, so don't really worry about the ups or downs right here, but our bodies, our brains start to say, life, you're doing too much. You're too busy. There's too much stress. There's too much trauma that you haven't dealt with, right? There's things that are overwhelming you. And our brain starts going, I'm going to make you aware any way that I can, right? So oftentimes people I've worked with, right, I feel like I can't breathe.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm overwhelmed, right? So there can be a lot of things that's happening in our body physically, right? Stomach things, extremity things. So, I mean, that's the general sense of what's happening in our body. It's our brain. What I tell people is it's our brain trying to warn us, like, you've got to stop and listen to me, right? Right. And when you live in dysregulation so long, that becomes normal, right? And we don't listen to our bodies well. So, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts with what's happening with us when we are dysregulated, when we go outside of our window of tolerance.
So good. I'm even thinking, just even thinking about the story that you shared when you were 3 and 4, the first time that you remember that you were dysregulated. I remember, I think it was maybe the year after my family moved to Japan. I was 9, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night and I couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
Like I just couldn't seem to get a breath. And I would go downstairs and I would just be like, and I had no idea that I was dysregulated. Obviously, I had no idea I was dysregulated. I had no idea that this was a panic attack.
Yeah.
Like I had no words, but being able to look back now and have more words for, like I was in a state of hyper arousal, like I was dysregulated, having those words can bring so much more clarity to our experiences.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
I love what you said just a couple of minutes ago, that we can often live our lives dysregulated.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, even coming back to the US from Japan and starting undergrad and going through grad school, living in cycles of dysregulation has been a very common theme for the last 6 years. And for me, I know that living in those cycles of dysregulation has caused a felt sense of powerlessness. Mm-hmm. Like I don't know what to do when I'm in it or how to get out of it. So, can you just talk about cycles of dysregulation and why it can be so hard to get back to a regulated state?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things about dysregulation, especially for people who have experienced trauma, maybe there's some developmental disorders, whatever may be happening, especially early in life, early brain development, right through young adulthood, right? If you don't have somebody who's helping you regulate, right? It's how we learn to regulate, right? We learn that someone says, "Hey, it's going to be okay," right? Yeah. You're okay. I don't know what your mom did when you were 9 and you went, right? But I imagine she said, "Hey, come here, let me hold you," or "Sit by me," or "Lay down in bed," or whatever she said, right? She helped to regulate you, right? So as we become adults, especially if we are dysregulated, right? We're having intense emotions. We're not really maybe aware of them, right? We can't manage our behavior. And then we avoid the difficult emotions too, because we're like, I don't know what to do with this, right? So it does feel powerless, right? We feel like I can't control this. So it's really hard to get back to it. Now, if you don't know what it is to really be regulated and live in the window of tolerance, wow, then it's really difficult, because then you're kind of saying, wow, how do I reverse time to understand how to regulate, right? for those of us who were blessed, fortunate enough to have parents who helped us with regulation, right? We have to remember those things. We have to go back to even some of those things. And then we keep learning as adults saying, hey, for me now, when I start to, at times, I still will get tingly feelings in my finger. I'll still sometimes, when I'm under a lot of stress, when I've been doing a lot of things, when I've been parenting my young adult children, whatever it may be, and I have to stop, right? I have to stop and say, okay, my body's telling me something, right? Right. I have to stop. And the first thing for me, talking for me, right? The first thing I really need to do is really slow down my breathing, be very consciously aware of my breathing, right? Right. I do my safety breathing, right? In through the nose, out through the mouth.
Yeah.
3 to 5 reps of that, right? I sometimes have to lay down, right? Just say like, okay, I do with my breathing also, right? I do some other things, but it's hard to get back to a regulated place, right? Once we've dysregulated, once we've gone out a window of tolerance, it's work. It's work to come back to it, right? You know, this is where a lot of dysfunctional, unhealthy behaviors can start, right? So I try not to use those either, but I'm just saying, it can really happen for a lot of people, for anybody, really. So it is hard work, and it's hard work because we're trying to come back to a place, right, out of something where we felt unsafe or hurt or afraid, right? So it's a lot of work. I'll stop there because I could go on about this forever. I love this kind of stuff. So
it's so good. I love what you said about listening to your body.
Mm-hmm.
That's been a huge part of my story that I'm still learning very much so in today, is learning how to befriend and listen to my body.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk to the person who maybe doesn't know how to listen to their body, or their body doesn't feel like a friend right now?
Yeah. For a lot of people, especially who have been through trauma or really difficult circumstances, right? There's other things that can help that dysregulate us. But for people who feel out of control, right? A lot of times we find ourselves as humans going to other things, other behaviors that necessarily we don't want, but they bring comfort, right? Right. That could be any number of things. We could name a whole list here that it could be. So if, whether I'm speaking to myself or someone who might be listening, you probably kind of know what those behaviors are in your life. Like things I do, I don't necessarily want, but I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So I do these behaviors and I feel better, at least in the short term. So to me, right, that needs to be a clue to say, what's happening? What's leading up to this? What does my body feel like right now? Right. I almost always start with that with people or with kids I'm working with. I'm like, like, tell me about how your body feels. Kids are like, what do you mean? Right. Like, I'm like, I don't know. Where do you feel right now? And they're like, oh, my head, or, or I don't know, or, but stopping, which we often feel uncomfortable with, Taylor, feel uncomfortable with stopping and saying like, what feels off or hurts in my body? Right. Right. Maybe I'm used to living with shortness of breath because I feel panicked all the time. Right. Maybe I have chronic headaches and I just like live through, right? I just keep going. Right. So, right, your body is trying to help you to recognize what's happening, and then it's slowing down and saying, what is the pain telling me, right? What can I do? And that's where a lot of people get stuck. Like, what do I do? I always feel this way, or feel away most of the time, right? And this is where, right, a lot of people, right, myself included, need help from somebody else.
Yeah.
right? Doesn't have to be a therapist, right? Maybe you have a really great friend, right? Maybe you have a loving mom who is really helpful to you in that way. Maybe you have a small group or a group of friends who can help you, right? But we really need help from other people, which can be really scary, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of my quick answer there for you.
I have a friend and we call each other dysregulation partners. So
I love that.
usually a week does not go by without one of us calling each other, and you hear either side, you hear this little small voice on the other side of the phone saying, I'm a little dysregulated right now. And neither of us we don't say much, but we listen.
Yeah. And what does that do for
And
you? What does that do for you?
I just feel my body just
Mm-hmm.
completely just relax.
Yeah.
When I know that there's going to be a person on the other side of the phone
Mm-hmm.
who is going to be calm and grounded and listen as I talk. And usually 10 minutes later, I'm not dysregulated. I'm able to come back down to at least somewhat of a more relaxed, regulated state.
That's great.
Yeah.
Like, we all need friends like that, right?
Yeah.
Friends who don't have to fix it, but someone who's there, right? Like, just in that time with you, right? Just being present with you, right? You guys are what did you call yourself? How do you say that?
Dysregulation partners.
Dysregulation partners, right? I mean, that's a lot what therapy is about, right? Is you have somebody who is like a dysregulator for you, right? Like, they help you in that process, right? I find this a lot with kids, especially young kids that I work with, right? Just being, whether it's in my play therapy office or even using telehealth, right? Just being that presence with a kid that says, hey, your mom told me that you've been having a lot of scary dreams.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you want to tell me anything about those? Or what do you want to share with me about that? And they'll just share a little bit, and you can just see the, like, right? Like, kind of just like, oh, someone's just listening to me, right? Right. So we need, our bodies are trying to communicate to us. And when their bodies are communicating, sometimes it's really hard to say, hey, this is what I need. This is what I need to do, or to ask for help. That's really hard. So there's a lot of people stuck in difficult places like that.
Yeah. As a final question, I am learning this personally in my life right now, but developing the ability to self-regulate is such an important part of living life the way that God designed. So can you talk about some practical ways that we can begin learning and practicing this right now in our lives?
Yeah. I think one of the things after whatever year that might have been, I don't know, when I first started getting these physical feelings of, like, I don't know what was happening in my body. There was a couple of things that I started doing. I started exercising regularly. I also finally gave in to the idea that I love plants and gardening, right? Like, I say that jokingly because I used to buy my wife plants and stuff and be like, oh, like, I bought these for you. And then I remember she started saying, I don't even really like plants. Like, why don't you just buy them for yourself? So I started looking for things, especially that were really just grounding exercises, right? Just things that were simple. And not everybody can plant a garden. I have a garden at my house now. I love it. I just actually was out there this morning, and my wife said, how's the garden? I said, oh my goodness. Like, it was amazing, right? Like, I'm dealing with plants.
Yeah.
I'm not dealing with people's problems. I'm not paying a bill. I'm not thinking about my trauma or my hurt. I'm just out here, like, harvesting cucumbers. It's like great, right? So finding activities that when you do them, you get that sense of like, hey, that was just relaxing. That was nice, right? So God has created us, right, really for a much slower pace of life than what we currently live at, right? So grounding exercises are just what the world has invented, like as a way to say, each day you need times of rest, right? And each week you need more extended times of rest, right? So in the Christian world, we would call that like sabbatical. We would call it Sabbath rest each week, right? Just a time where you take time and you don't do your normal work, right? This is so important for me, right? Right. I love to go for walks, right? I've also discovered that, right, I really need good friendships, which I'm not saying you just make that up, right? You don't make it up. But I really learned that I need to put hard work into friendships, right? We might call it community. Maybe it's at your church. Maybe it's in your neighborhood, right? Like finding a community of people who just care about you and just like you for who you are, right? I think it's so important, right? Like God designed us for relationship. And isolation, right, really is damaging to us, right? So, whether you're married or single, whether you're a young person or an older person, like we need community. We need people. So those are just some of the things that I found helpful in my life, and I talk a lot about with my clients. Just what are you doing? What do you allow yourself to do where you just get a sense of, oh, that was nice, right? I recently started drawing a little bit more. I'm not a good drawer at all. It's not my thing. I have an older brother who's an amazing artist, but it's not my thing. But I have found just like the process of sitting and just like doing something. Now that's not going to be for everybody, because you might be like, this is frustrating, I don't like it. But right, finding those things that you get that sense of, I feel content. I feel peaceful, right? It may not be for very long, right? But that's where you start building your window of tolerance for even those things, right? I'm expanding my window, right? Think of 60-40 or 70-30 instead of maybe where you are right now, which may be not very wide, right? So expanding that window of tolerance is really important for us as human beings, how God has designed us. So some of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's so good. I think such a good place to end, just thinking about that question. What are the things that make us able to exhale and breathe? Yeah. Whether for me, that's running. I started paint by number recently, trying different things. But yeah, what are the things that help us breathe and exhale? So good. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation, David. I'm really grateful for your time and insight today.
No problem. Glad to do it. Thanks.
Wasn't that such a helpful and insightful conversation? I love how David described the window of tolerance and the different ways that emotional dysregulation can show up in our lives. Whether this looks like exploding or imploding, whether it feels like getting really angry or shutting down, dysregulating moments always point to something deeper, something that needs to be noticed, named, and processed inside of us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I'll see you next week. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram @TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.